Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Please come in and take a seat. Welcome to this session on the credibility over time that builds trust, the ESG disclosure debate here in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27 on the climate action stage. Thank you to Kite and the Climate Action Group for hosting this event. And we have a great panel here with us to have a discussion around this issue. My name is Rajiv Joshi. I'm Associate Dean for Climate Action at Columbia University's New Climate School. And it's a privilege to be here to talk about this question, which I've worked on for a number of years initially as one of the managing directors of the B team, which is also working on this question with business leaders. So I'm joined by a distinguished panel, and I'm going to invite each of them to introduce themselves. Beginning with Amanda to my very far right.
Aloha everybody, my name is Amanda Ellis. I'm Senior Director for the ASU Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Lab. And the lab's purpose is to help create just and regenerative global futures, grounded in Indigenous wisdom, but leveraging high tech as well. And we run a whole range of research centers from the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions right through to global governance.
Hi everyone, I'm Beth Burks. I work at S&P Global Ratings, the credit rating agency. I'm a director of the sustainable finance team. So what we do is we oversee the sustainable debt markets, and we also analyze companies from an ESG perspective. So that's what I'm here to talk about.
Hi, my name is Dr. Ndidi Noli Adozian. I sit on the International Sustainability Standards Board of the IFRS Foundation. This is a very exciting COP for us because we were born at COP26. And so it's really exciting to be here at COP27 and speak about the progress so far. Our objective is to create one set of standards from the alphabet soup of standards for sustainability. We've issued 2 exposure drafts, and I'm really excited to be here at this forum.
Thank you. So we're having, I would say, a critical convergence of different questions coming together here, whether it's the pushback on the EU rules or whether it's the fact that the ESG debate is heating up in the US as we're seeing conservative backlash on this agenda. We're at a moment, some would call it an inflection point on this agenda. And I'd just like to invite each of our panelists to talk about whether they think we are having a credibility crisis or whether we're about to move into a new era where ESG will become the mainstream way in which this agenda will move forward, and that we will have the accountability that many here who have come to COP27 are looking for in order to deliver against the Paris Agreement. Start with you, Dr. Ndibi.
Okay, there are a few principles that we build on. One of them is connectivity. So it's really important that we take sustainability as we understand it and are able to convert that into material metrics that fit into the financial statements and allow investors to have decision-useful material. Because at the end of the day, excuse me, at the end of the day, if we don't have a set of standards that allows for comparability across jurisdictions, but also across a different range of entities, then we do not have decision-useful material. Secondly, if we don't have standards that you can deploy in the global south and in the global north with large cap listed companies, but also smaller entities in the supply chain, then we do not have a useful. Hello? Not just, this is awesome. Thank you, Beth. I'll take the 4th, just in case. We'll hold all to them. We've got all of them. So in other words, we cannot have a multiplicity of standards. We need one standard. And so it's not just connectivity, connecting sustainability metrics to financial metrics for decision-useful information. It's also scalability, ensuring that the standards have provisions to be applied across all jurisdictions and all size, pace, scope of entities. Thirdly, the building block approach. So what we've said is we're building a truly global baseline so that other jurisdictional requirements and other standards can actually be built around our truly global baseline. I think the last point worth mentioning is, as I said initially, the ISSB, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, sits alongside the IASB, which is the International Accounting Standards Board, that is active in 144 jurisdictions. We're on the African continent, close to the Middle East. All of these jurisdictions have adopted IASB. So there's a reason why the IFRS Foundation houses both, and hopefully if we can build the connectivity between those two, we can also channel, and this will be my final point, channel more capital and investments in the direction of taking action about what it is so urgently required that we speak about, but also collaboratively act on.
Thanks. So just to let you know, I sit in between working with companies on their ESG and with investors. So I kind of sit in between the two. And that gives a kind of unique perspective because with companies, they are really struggling. They really want to disclose what's right for investors, and they want to do it thoroughly. But they also get a lot of different requests of what to disclose. So I think that really speaks to the need to have a global standard. The other thing is that, as you mentioned, issuers that are in developing markets, sometimes the needs of a sustainability needs are very, very different in those markets. And so what they're choosing to sort of invest in and call green, for instance, and what's needed differs. And I'll give you an example. So we worked with one of the banks in Thailand, and one of the critical needs there was to collect waste. So not even just looking at recycling rates yet, it was a waste collection problem. Clearly in Europe we don't have that issue. So investing in that was not necessarily something that we would potentially call green. Whereas in Thailand, it's obviously that critical first step. So I think it's worth understanding that there is a different journey in different parts of the world of what's needed in terms of investment. From the other side, from investors, what they're really asking for is to make sure that whatever disclosures are made, that the KPIs are really linked to the strategy of the organization. And they really want that to be very explicit in the disclosures. So if the strategy is to move towards sort of more low carbon products that they're selling, or more low pollution products and so on and so forth, they want to make sure that the KPIs that you're using to track that business transformation are linked in the strategy and clearly disclosed, and that there's a, sorry for the sound issues, that there's a strong, I'm scared to speak now. Is that one working? Is that one working? Fantastic. Okay. So that there's a good governance in place. And when you work with companies, when they're starting to develop new KPIs, or they're working KPIs from standards usually. That's okay. Let's try. Okay. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. So yes, the governance standards are in place. And one thing you do find from working with companies is that a lot of them are still trying to develop and break down the silos from within their organizations to get the data they need to disclose. That in itself can be very transformational for companies. So breaking down those silos, getting that data up to the corporate level, creates the connections that organization needs to then embark on actually implementing their strategy. So disclosure really does lead to action. And you have seen that. I mean, there have been academic studies from the long history of the UK's mandatory carbon disclosures that has led to emission reductions over time. So we know that disclosure is kind of that starting point. And I think it's really worth sort of just realizing why it is. And it's because you're breaking down those silos. It's because departments within that corporation are speaking to each other that may never have spoken to each other before. When I've done some working with companies on analyzing their ESG, sometimes it's been the first time that the Treasury Department has met the Sustainability Reporting Department, was when they met with us. And they're both, kind of producing into the same PDF at the end of the day. And so I think it's like very, very important, this ESG movement that's been kind of going on, and I think there will be some validity to it. I think over what metrics are the right metrics, I think we'll be debating this till the cows come home, but...
No, they're getting on with it.
They're getting on with it, so, yeah.
Well, I'm very excited to be here because I am, first of all, really, really pleased that there's going to be one easy to understand global standard, set of global standards. And for those of you who have tried to work your way through the alphabet soup associated with ESG, environment, social governance, I'm sure you're excited too. So hearing Dr. Nidhi today is very uplifting. And I love the idea that you can actually combine the strategy to the investment action. So thinking about some of the practicalities of this, and perhaps coming back to Raj's original question about is there some greenwashing potentially going on, I think there was great excitement when BlackRock came out and persuaded the investor roundtable in the US, the business roundtable in the US, to really support this notion of thinking about broader stakeholders, not just about shareholders. And the fact that that was then picked up in Davos and became the Davos Declaration, the Davos Manifesto, really was the beginning of quite a new movement around thinking about environment, social and governance as part of a broader investment approach. And I'm old enough to remember when we were all just focused on very basic, oops, thank you, this is so much fun. It's kind of like a juggling, So one of the, I was very privileged as an economist at the World Bank in the 2000s to run the World Bank President's Global Private Sector CEO Forum. And it was very interesting seeing back then, 20 years ago, that CEOs were beginning to realize that we needed to look at now what is called ESG and is almost just part of our nomenclature these days. So there are two things that I want our experts to really think about. First of all, Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are being pretty well tracked. But Scope 3, as Dr. Nidhi pointed out, is really dependent on supply chains and entrepreneurs in the supply chain. And I have a photo here of Malala because I want to remind everybody that there are women-led businesses in the supply chain who are at significant disadvantage. And this needs to become part of the S and the G. So the S from a private sector perspective and the G from a public sector perspective. And I'm going to ask our audience a little question. Does anyone know how many countries, as of 2022, have achieved full gender equality? 0, yes. Yes, we have a correct answer immediately. Can anyone tell me how many countries in 2022 have achieved gender equality, full gender equality in legislation, i.e. there's a level playing field for women entrepreneurs? 68? Did I hear 68? It's less than 68? Any other guesses? Do I have a decline? 3. A little more. So there's 12 countries, all of whom are in Europe except for Canada, that have a level playing field. So I really want to urge companies to think about, as they are measuring Scope 3, and they're also thinking about the S, that they need to be thinking about the disadvantage at which women entrepreneurs, who are so important for global governance issues, and I hope that we can persuade public policy to really take a step forward and to help support. So we do have a level playing field. So for me, this is about public policy and it's about private sector development. And we really do need those kinds of partnerships.
Thank you. At this COP meeting, there's, I think, a critical discourse around not just when companies have an obligation to disclose their impacts, and this panel is partly about disclosure and ESG, the metrics that are being used increasingly with the accounting frameworks that are being created, is about companies very clearly articulating the risks that they have in terms of their environment, social and governance risk, and there being a clear mandate for those risks to be shared with shareholders. But in terms of building trust, consumers and other stakeholders also want to see that companies and other non-state actors are not only understanding their risks and reflecting on those risks, but taking clear steps to reducing their negative impacts and maximizing their positive impacts in terms of gender equity and many other dimensions of a company. How do you see that agenda moving forward? How do you see the potential for companies as we become more and more conscious of our impacts, stepping up and becoming, as Paul Polman and others have put it out, as kind of not net positive companies? Do you see that movement beginning, and what can we do to accelerate it in terms of policy and legislation?
I think this is a great question, and I think, honestly, we're schizophrenic. I was with Paul on the plane yesterday, and I was remembering his statement, there's no business to be done on a dead planet. And yet, the IMF data for 2020 showed $5.9 trillion, trillion with a T, in subsidies to fossil fuels, both direct and indirect. And yet, we're trying to move away from that. So we do need to align public policy. I guess the second thing I would say that's really positive is that 90% of large companies have actually committed to net zero by 2050. So that's very positive. How do we then track that? It's much lower for companies that are not publicly listed. So that does give us an indication that public scrutiny and the kind of work that my wonderful two colleagues are doing really does make a difference. The third thing I would say is an independent mechanism, and I'm hoping that many of you will be able to come to the launch that Al Gore is doing of Climate Trace tomorrow. This is tracking real-time carbon emissions, and I've had a bit of a sneak preview, and this is a consortium of 100 tech companies, and we happen to have one of our centers, the Global Airborne Observatory, involved. And so these 100 AI and tech companies have come together using satellites from space and machine learning, and they can now track emissions down to the granular level. So I can tell you that number 327 is a rice field emitting methane in China, and that ranks number 327 in terms of emissions. So this is going to be such a powerful tool for investors to be able to use. It's kind of a Wikipedia of emissions, and I think companies are then going to be much more aware that they are being tracked as well as disclosing. So for me, that's a real positive.
Oh, I think that's so interesting because I've worked a lot with the Earth observation sector, and I think that there's a number of opportunities that that's unlocking, not only just the emission tracking from space, but also the traceability of supply chains and the deforestation angle. And so because the cost of satellite launch has come right down, and you've got new commercial entry into the space where you can really tailor the satellites to look at very specific things, it's starting to unlock the potential to verify a lot of the data. And the verification is really the next step following the disclosure. And you're seeing that come through in the new regulations that are coming in. So in the EU from 2025, there'll have to be assurance level on the ESG data metrics, and that applies to listed companies and non-listed. So once the data is then available, it's making sure that it's properly verified. And some of the studies that have come out of the Earth observation have shown a massive underreporting. And it's exactly. So, and it's, I'm sympathetic to a degree because a lot of the information collection has been done based on estimated data, on paper surveys and things like that. So it's not been sort of robustly measured or tracked or digitally tracked. And that's one, yeah, exactly. And you see different emission factors between countries and standards and so on and so forth. So it is, a real potential, hopefully, to use some technology to close some of that data gap there. And so I think that's it. But really then it's, okay, once you've measured and tracked and reported, got it verified, is how are you actually really bringing it down? And what are the actions? And that then goes back to that whole strategy and business model and shifts and what's going on. And there's a variety of ways to obviously bring down emissions according to the different initiatives, including a lot of the net zero ones. And at least from when we're analysing that, we're looking at the potential for additionality in terms of the emission reductions that are being achieved. And with that, we're looking at whether or not they're having to use energy certificates for their Scope 2 emissions, or whether or not they're actually kind of really reducing it by ensuring that there's additional renewable energy capacity being brought on for those sites. For some companies, it really comes down to just feasibility. They may not have the space to bring on their own renewable generation. They may not be large enough as an energy user to enter into a power purchase agreement or something like that. But we're starting to see a few innovations come through where corporations are trying to band together to collectively invest in a new renewable generation capacity, which is really interesting. So I think there is some good news. There's progress happens. It's slow, we know that. But there is a lot of interesting things that are going on at the moment that give me hope.
Dr. Ndidi, given your role in the International Sustainability Standards Board, many who are here at COP27 are eagerly anticipating a report that's coming out on Thursday that the Secretary General has commissioned of the high-level experts group on the net zero commitments of non-state actors. And a lot of what's in that report, I believe, will be calling for a much tougher approach, for greater regulation, and for standards to play a critical role in the thousands of pledges and commitments that have been made by companies and other municipalities to reduce their emissions over time. What role do you see for standards and regulations as we look toward the science that calls on all of us to have emissions by 2030, if we have any chance of staying within 1.5, which we know has a significant impact on the livelihoods of millions of people around the world, at the same time ensuring that that's going to be a just and fair and equitable transition. As you look at that agenda, what do you see the role of standards, and coming from your perspective in particular, how can you build perhaps on what's going to be coming out this week from the Secretary General?
Well, that's a big question, but it's also a very important and critical one. Yes, we're racing against time. In front of the innovation zone, there's a countdown clock, which makes us all aware of that. Second, the space that we're in, which I learned this morning is called the innovation zone, because it's supposed to be a space that spurs action and outcomes, and it's supposed to be a nexus between the public sector and the private sector, is a great space to be having this conversation. The fact that this is taking place on the African continent, in a country that sits at the cusp between Africa and the Middle East, is making us even more conscious of the fact that we must address climate action in the context of the just transition, and that ensuring that we carry, or rather put it this way, that a rising tide lifts all boats, because you cannot activate climate action in one part of the world and presume that you can ignore anywhere else. Whether you're speaking about this from a Scope 3 perspective, whether you're speaking about it from the point of view of the fact that the climate is everywhere, it doesn't matter. So what's the role of standards? The thing about the standards that the International Standards Board has put out is, first of all, there are two exposure drafts on standards so far. The first one is generically sustainability related. For accountants in the room, that's like IAS 1, IAS 8. And it really builds on 4 pillars, namely the TCFD pillars. Starting from governance, has to be anchored in the highest level of governance in the organization. It needs to be embedded in strategy. That's the second pillar. So at the core of corporate strategy and business models, which means we need to rethink. And to some extent, we need to unthink. But most importantly, we need to embrace holistic systems thinking so that, for example, when we're talking about renewables or we're talking about upcycling or we're talking about material use, we're also talking about what else can we do with waste, for instance, plastic waste. And to what extent can we deploy this, and this is the 4th pillar, not just to deal with risks. So we need to look at risks, we need to anticipate what kind of risks there are, and we have embraced scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. We've also embraced scenario analysis because we need to ask ourselves, how does this impact our future? Because we need to begin to think about resilience. Resilience for corporates, but resilience also for economies and resilience for people, all of which come together to build resilience for the planet. And the last metric is really, the last pillar is targets and metrics. What we measure begins to guide us as to where we can take action and above all, where investments can flow. It's not enough, however, to speak about only what we measure. So we have to actually learn, unlearn, and relearn what it is out there in terms of sustainability thinking. What the ISSB as a standard will focus on is investors, because our objective is to help investors make the right decisions in terms of channeling capital. What we will also be doing is working across different jurisdictions, because it's the jurisdictions that must adopt. What we have at the moment are very exciting conversations, and you will hear tomorrow on main stage, so you're hearing a pre-announcement of that we have a partnership framework. And the ISSB is committed not just to develop these standards, and like I said, there's the sustainability-related standards. We've done the first standard beyond that, which is climate. We've also issued a digital reporting framework, because we have to find a taxonomy that works across different standards, across different jurisdictions, so that when we're speaking about things, we're speaking about the same thing. We're measuring the same thing, so that you can compare across jurisdictions, across companies, but not just horizontally, also vertically, so that ultimately you can trace right down to the last producer at the end of your value chain and supply chain. That's absolutely critical. And so in that instance, and I'll stop here, one of the things the ISSB is committed to, and we're totally open to partnering with academia, with other institutions, pan-continental institutions, to support, to handhold, to ensure that it's not just about the issuance of standards, but it's also working with stakeholders, with the companies, with the jurisdictions, with the regulators, with the academic institutions, to ensure that people have the knowledge. Because you see, when they say knowledge is power, it's partly because the fear of the unknown is very, very crippling. So once we have an understanding of what the challenge is, we're better equipped to overcome whatever hurdles there are, collaboratively and together.
That is so exciting. And I just want to pick up on the collaboratively and make a real-time offer right now. So we are helping the Interparliamentary Union and the Commonwealth with training for parliamentarians around, we've done SDG 5 and we hope it will make an impact, and now SDG 13 on climate and beyond. And so I would like to make a real-time offer that we would love to help work with you so that we can include this in our training for parliamentarians so they understand, because it is a very complex world, and you have just done a brilliant job of really distilling it in such a succinct and helpful way that the offer is there. The Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Lab would love to help support.
And maybe Columbia can jump in and help as we do some climate response academies around the world. Amanda, you started off talking a little bit about not only the head that we need to shift, but also the heart that needs to shift in terms of the mindset that we're taking into this question. You know, CEOs and the work that we've done at the B team and other places are moving on this agenda because they also have shifted in their values. And we do need a shift in values in a very short period of time if we're going to see the world deliver on its environmental, social, and governance principles. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that perspective and how we do both the inner work as well as the outer work.
So first of all, I want to give a big shout out to the brilliant job that you did with the B team, because really that whole there is no plan B and there is no planet B was instrumental, I think, in helping the business community begin to make that shift. So you were a first mover, and so thank you very much for that work. We're seeing now youth, and 5 years ago, I was reminded reading on the plane that 5 years ago, nobody had really heard of Greta Thunberg or the Fridays for Future movement. And you think about the incredible impact that has had. Some of you are too young to have kids, I can see in the room, but most of us have kids, have nieces, nephews, and we care about their futures. And we know that we have zoomed past 1.5 degrees. I work with the Earth League. We manage the Earth League with Johan Rockstrom and Peter Schlosser. And the scientists are telling us we've blown through 1.5. Now we have to be very careful to stick within 2 degrees. We all care about the future generations. And I think the biggest shifts have come from those who are realizing, as John Doerr did, when his daughter said, well, Dad, what are you doing? And so now he's just given $1 billion to Stanford to set up a climate school. So we're seeing really that young people are having a big impact on their parents' values. And I think we want to remember, as Paul says, no business to be done on a dead planet. We want to be making sure that we are the stewards for the future generation. That's why Indigenous wisdom is also so important, thinking 7 generations ahead. So it's about values, but it's also about common standards, and it's about investors investing in the right things. And I'm going to give a challenge to Beth. We heard about GFANs and this fabulous, trillions of dollars, $130 trillion for climate finance at COP26. And I was really excited about that, but I'm hearing that it's not materializing. So I'm going to put out a challenge to Beth and ask her why that is not happening, and why Africa is coming here and saying, hey, you're asking us to keep our fossil fuels in the ground, but how are we going to create economic growth without financial support? Beth, tell us.
Thanks so much. It's probably the $2.4 trillion question, right? Yeah, that's true. Where do I start with that one? I think there's a huge amount of desire from the top levels of the organization to start aligning with the Paris Agreement. And there's a section that's Article, sorry, I'm going to get very nerdy here now, Article 2.1c, which talks about aligning all financial flows with a low carbon, climate resilient development. And it's that piece that I think that investors are really starting to tackle. We had the sustainable debt markets, that kind of was the first piece, right, by the multi-development banks and the green bonds, and that's been going since 2007 now. That's just one small sliver of finance. It's about 12% now of the debt capital markets is sustainable labeled debt. Yeah. And overall, obviously, because of the environment we're in and the interest rates, debt markets are down, understandably. But there's a real disconnect, and this is what's kind of being discussed at the moment as part of the global stock take over in the blue zone, that the definition of what constitutes climate finance hasn't really been firmed up. And I think the private sector's understanding of that aspect and the negotiators' understanding of that aspect is fairly different. There's the big GCF, and there's other sort of climate finance dedicated funds that are available for developing countries to access to implement climate mitigation and adaptation projects that they have on their ground. But getting the sort of private sector to rechannel those assets that are under management, which means they exist somewhere, debt, equity, and whole host of other different instruments via the banks as well. You have a huge broad array of financial instruments that are now needing to be aligned to low carbon. I would say in the recent year, I have seen banks and issuers start to think about, okay, if we move beyond the bonds, the loans, into the other aspects that make up a corporate treasury's financing components, including commercial paper and derivatives and all sorts of other funky instrument types, they're starting to try and figure out what does that mean, aligning with a low carbon for these different instrument types, knowing that sometimes they're just plugging a working capital hole. So really, I think there's a lot of detailed thinking that's going on at the moment within the financial institution community to figure out how do we then apply these sort of green bond-like type labeling to the full investment portfolio. And I'm quite optimistic that we will get to a convergence. I think the 100 billion quantified goal for climate finance is a sort of also separate discussion, but it will need private sector flows to help achieve that and to step up the ambition of climate finance that the governments really desperately need. So yeah, I'll probably end there. Thanks for the tough question.
No, I think it's a great question, and it actually helps me explain exactly why are we, as the International Sustainability Standards Board, focused on investors. And we are decidedly focused on investors because we need to have decision-useful information that's climate-related, sustainability-related from a risk and opportunity point of view. Because we need to channel this capital to begin to build new types of businesses, new types of industries, to rethink the way that we use material and the way that the environment can actually work in collaboration with our capitalist system in order to protect the planet, but also grow businesses at the same time. So it's not just about ranking back. It's about looking at the world and constructing things differently. So we are determined, and we don't sleep. I tell you, we don't sleep. Our staff are exhausted, and we're racing from a standard-setting perspective in a way that the world has not seen. We are transforming and totally changing the IFRS foundation from the inside out, so that it's not just about accounting standards that guide investment, but sustainability metrics as well. And honestly, the only way to make this happen so that people who are making intentions known, let me praise the intention. The intention is there, but it's not enough. We have to have this one set, and this is almost an appeal, because we cannot build a truly global baseline if not everyone decides what these guys are doing makes sense. We were born at COP26 in order to drive action. We're back at COP27, and every single thing that we were born with, we have delivered on, plus more. Tomorrow we have a roundtable with about 20 African ministers to talk about creating early adoption, so that actually those jurisdictions that typically do not have an input into creating standards are at the table early and are saying, this works, this doesn't work, we've tried this, we're struggling. And it's not that we're building standards that are in any way, if we were building standards that were not up to par, we would not have standards with Scope 3. We're doing Scope 3. But beyond doing Scope 3, we will also do the capacity building. We will build in the reliefs. We will allow for provisions for time, for adoption in order that we can deliver one truly global set of metrics that investors can use to hopefully channel investment in the direction of your very challenging and good question.
So this is fantastic, and I have another offer. We have a free global tool that was developed for the We Empower UN SDG Challenge that was launched by Secretary General Guterres and the then President of the World Bank, Jim Kim, in 2018. Now, this tool was designed for women entrepreneurs to help measure Scope 3, but it's free, and I'm going to offer that to you as, again, something that you can offer for those who are wanting to do Scope 3 but not having to pay. So another offer, if that can be helpful.
I think we should shake hands on the partnership.
Yes.
All of these offers, I think,
This is great to have philanthropists who are trying to move the dial. So Julie Wrigley is just a phenomenal visionary, and she really wants to help save the planet. So delighted to offer that as a free tool.
And I think we're taking offers from everyone.
Yeah.
So make sure you keep your offers before you leave the room.
Yeah.
I want to thank our panel. I mean, I think we are at a very critical crossroads. We want to move from an economy where our balance sheets don't just show the financial taking, but also show the balance of giving, not just on the environmental side, but also on the social side and on the economic side. So we have a truly holistic view of how we're developing towards a more regenerative model. And the ESG agenda is a critical piece of that puzzle, but not the only piece of that puzzle. And I think you'll see in the discussions here at the climate action stage, throughout COP27, many people starting to come together to start thinking about, not just here, also in a few weeks when we're together in Montreal for COP15 on biodiversity, and the natural capital agenda is absolutely linked to this agenda. That companies are beginning to move to that model of thinking, how can we be net positive? How do we move beyond the model of an extractive system towards one which gives more than it takes from people and planet, which is really where we're all trying to get to. I want to thank all of our panelists, Dr. Ndibi, Beth, Amanda. You brought such wisdom to this conversation. I think everyone is got many ideas. Hopefully it will inspire more of your offers. And thank you to Kite and the team at the Climate Action Group for holding us here for this lovely discussion. And we'll speak again. Thank you.